I'm going to start now. Okay, good. Go ahead.
Hello and welcome. Welcome to this webinar that is sponsored by Evangelicals for Justice as part of the Lamenting Christian Nationalism Week of Action. We are so excited that you have decided to come and to join us for this conversation and to help us get better oriented and to better understand. We're going to have a conversation for this next hour, drawing on the insights from Daniel Hill, Randy Woodley, Sung-Chan Ra, and Lisa Sharon Harper. They're going to help us at a sort of a 101 level understand Christian nationalism and better how the church can engage and respond. The format for today is we'll have each of our speakers speak for about 10 minutes to just give us an education. So pull up close, grab your pen and paper or your notebook of some sort, and we're going to go to school for a little bit, and then we'll have an opportunity to do question and answer afterwards. If you have any questions, feel free to drop it into the chat, and using the last 10 or 15 minutes, we will go ahead and have that time. So Daniel, would you start us off?
Yes, thank you so much, Nikki. Hi, everybody. It's an honor to be here, and I'm mostly excited to learn from these incredible panelists. So at our church, I pastor a church here in Chicago. So we believe that this is a total discipleship issue to be able to identify and respond to Christian nationalism. You know, we often talk about the fact that though there's a very distinct American form of it, we'll talk about that in a minute. This is not a new idea, right? You could argue that this is what got Stephen stoned and killed in the book of Acts, is when he confronted Christian nationalism, essentially. And so I think it's as old as the times of Jesus. And I think it's required that Jesus followers in every generation can spot the form of it. So I'm just going to kind of walk you through. I try to keep a condensed version for our church that we just kind of walk through this small handful of slides whenever we're trying to develop some vocabulary on Christian nationalism. And I will acknowledge when we talk about in our church, we actually call it white Christian nationalism, because I think it's hard to pull kind of white supremacy out of this. So I'm going to bring this up. Is there a way to, Nikki, is there a way to screen share, or I can just show it from, so I'm going to bring it up on my screen and then, okay. So pulling the words apart a little bit. So I think first we have to get a little bit of a working definition of the word nationalism. So just to take it straight from the dictionary, a sense of national consciousness, exalting one nation above all others and placing primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interests, as opposed to those of other nations. This definition, just a straight secular level, shows how nationalism, even as an isolated force, can become dangerous very quickly. Whereas there's a distinction typically made between patriotism, which is describing more one's affection for or commitment to their country. Nationalism describes a view of one's nation as above all others. It emphasizes the superior traits of that particular nation and promotes those traits over the traits and values of another. Excuse me. There's different ways to define white supremacy, but here's kind of the working definition we use. And so I'm going to use this as part of the nationalism definition. White supremacy is the evil principality ideology that denies and distorts the image of God inherent to all human beings based upon a set of lies that assign superior whiteness, which is the most important part, assigns inferiority to blackness, and measures all human value based on perceived proximities to these two poles. That's just one way to look at it. But I want to say that in terms of the American context, it's very important to see when we're talking about nationalism, that nationalism and white supremacy have always been fused together. As a result, the superiority assigned to whiteness through white supremacy, and the superiority assigned to America through nationalism have become so intertwined that they're nearly impossible to pull apart. Now, I'm sure we're going to hear a lot about this from our panelists, so I'll just say a quick word on American Christianity. Of course, it's risky to put together all of the different streams of Christianity under one banner, so I'm taking some enormous kind of liberties here, but just in terms of doing this in a succinct manner, America's form of nationalism is historically unique because its origins are rooted in a Christian vision for its expression and growth. One of the most common terms you'll hear for this is manifest destiny, which literally translates the obvious will of God. And manifest destiny said at a very simple level took God's promises to Israel in the Old Testament, that they would become God's channel of blessing to the rest of the world, and then applied that promise of the Israelites to the emerging vision of the United States of America. For me, this helps me kind of just get my arms around kind of how manifest destiny within America works. One, a belief that the Christian morals, values, and institutions of the United States are both righteous and superior. Two, that God has tasked this country with the responsibility to spread these ideas for the benefit of the world. And three, that God had blessed America to succeed in this task, and that success, particularly economic success, was an ongoing confirmation of that blessing. So when we're talking about white Christian nationalism, we're merging these ideas together, and we see that there's a unique form of white Christian nationalism that's rampant in America. It shares traits with other forms of nationalism, which of course any country can have nationalism, that it sees its own country as superior to others. However, American form of nationalism is uniquely dangerous because it also weaves these two additional elements into its brand. First, white Christian nationalism believes that our superiority is directly tied to our white origins. So race and white supremacy are always tied to nationalism in America. Second, white Christian nationalism believes that God has ordained our country superior to others, meaning that Christianity is forever tied to nationalism. So that's a quick way to look at it, some of the terms, and I'll wrap up my part of it here and look forward to learning from these other amazing panelists.
Thank you, Daniel. Am I not on here? Sorry. Can you hear me? I think.
We lost your video.
Okay, I will keep talking while the video comes back on. How's that?
That sounds
okay.
Great. You're back on.
Thanks. Well, I want to give a couple of terms, definitions of a couple of terms here that might help us to reflect on the insidious power of something like Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism. And those two terms are fairly familiar to many of us. The first word is imagination, and the second word is narrative. Imagination first was used by the idea of social imagination was first used by C. Wright Mills back in many years back, about 70 years ago, to describe how human experience shapes how people understand possibilities and limitations in the world. So imagination is not like the figment of your imagination or making stuff up. It really is how a person relates to the world and the possibilities, both good and bad, in the world, what they imagine the world can be or should be. The other part of that is the theological imagination, and probably best used by Willie Jennings, also William Cavanaugh, where they're looking at how the possibility of what they see in the world is shaped not just by society or psychology or cultural reasons, but it's shaped by theology, that a person's theology or theological understanding shapes their imagination. Willie Jennings would assert that the theology that is functional, the theological imagination in the West is a dysfunctional, diseased theological imagination, because that theological imagination, or the possibility of how the world is and what the world is, really emerges from the sense of white supremacy or white centrality. And this is where we get to narratives, how narratives and imagination play off of each other. Imagination shapes our narratives and narratives shape our imagination. So for example, if there is a dominant narrative in American society or Western culture of Eurocentric white primacy, centrality, superiority, supremacy, whatever language you choose to use, then that is going to shape your understanding of the possibilities of the world. And it's also going to get embedded into your understanding of the world through narratives that you operate out of. So again, these are kind of more abstract concepts, but let me try to see if I can give some concrete examples of this, of both the imagination and the narrative. Walter Wink talks about the narrative within Western culture of the myth or the narrative of redemptive violence. But I want to tie that into the myth and narrative of American exceptionalism, which of course ties in with Christian nationalism. And that is the belief that Americans or the United States has an exceptional status, whether that is before God or before all of the world. And therefore, it can use, for example, violence in a redemptive manner compared to other nations. And the example that I can think of was a few years ago when we had a lot of concern, and maybe justifiably, about the possession of nuclear weapons or the use of potential use of nuclear weapons by North Korea, and that Kim Jong-un might actually have nuclear weapons. But the myth of American exceptionalism and the myth of redemptive violence for exceptional people like the US meant that there was concern about North Korea having weapons, but no conversation about, well, should the United States have these same weapons and actually more of these weapons? So think about this illustration with me. You walk into a room and there are 7 people in that room, and every single person has an AR-15 rifle. There's a guy in the corner with a crazed look on his face, but he doesn't know what to do with that weapon. In fact, he's fumbling with it. He drops it a few times. It falls apart in his hands. There's something really, he doesn't know what he's doing. That's Kim Jong-un. No clue what he's doing with that weapon. But the guy that I'm most afraid of is not just the guy who just got the weapon, but I'm really afraid of the person who has the weapon, has used the weapon, and has used the weapons to kill civilians. And so there's only one person in the room with that kind of history, has the weapon, has used the weapon, and has used the weapons to kill civilian lives, and that's the United States. But the myth of American exceptionalism, the myth of redemptive violence and the capacity for redemptive violence by Americans only, means that we ignore that reality and actually jump to, well, they can't have nuclear weapons, but we certainly can. They can't use violence redemptively, but we certainly can, because we are exceptional Americans. So that ties in with Christian nationalism, and that the imagination that says, I believe that Americans are exceptional. I believe that Americans are building the city set on a hill. I believe that Americans have a special endowment from God so that we can fulfill a manifest destiny, that we can have this kind of American exceptionalism. That narrative, that imagination, becomes a part of what feeds into this Christian nationalism. So this idea of white centrality, white primacy, American exceptionalism has a long historical roots, and I think Randy will talk about some of these. I just want to give the 2 identifying markers. One, of course, is the doctrine of discovery, where the church, the diseased theological imagination of the church, says that the European body is superior to other bodies. Therefore, when the European body sees the black body in Africa, you can take the black body as slaves. Therefore, when the European body sees the continent of the Americas, there's really no human life there. It's just an empty land. And therefore, you can take possession of that land and be the discoverers of a new continent, even though there are millions of lives and thousands of civilizations already there. So that's the imagination. That's the narrative that got embedded in that led to these kinds of actions. What I want to point out is that what we're seeing with Christian nationalism is simply the practicing and the enactment of an embedded imagination and an embedded narrative. The way to think about this is my son and I love good movies, and one of the things we like is to reflect on good actors. And a lot of actors use something called method acting. And method acting is simply a person embodies a character so deeply that if they ever have to improvise a line, it's accurate to that character because they're so into that character. Example would be if you run into De Niro at a Starbucks, don't talk to him. If he's making a movie and it's a gangster movie, he'll actually talk to you like he's an actual gangster. So this idea of embodying narratives or embodying a character so deeply that your instinctive reflexive action comes out of that, well, that is a case in point of Christian nationalism. We have embodied and embedded American exceptionalism, white superiority to such a level that our instinct is to operate out of Christian nationalism, that our intuition, our improvisational lines, what we say and do comes out of that embedded nationalism, embedded sense of white superiority or white centeredness. The question then is, how do we begin to confront that deeply embedded narrative, that deeply embedded imagination, when so much of our culture and our society has spoken of that kind of narrative? I'll pause there and I'll toss it over to my dear friend, Randy.
Thanks, Sunchan. And Daniel and Elisa, I know you have some great things to share as well. So I'll try to be very succinct in what I'm going to do, and hopefully leave some good time for discussion. I'm my wife and I, Edith, are co-sustainers of a place called Elahe Indigenous Center for Earth Justice and Elahe Farm and Seeds. And I'm also a professor at Portland Seminary here in Portland, Oregon. And I think I've taught church history 21 times so far. I think I get to teach it 2 more times and before I retire. I always begin that class by saying this: there is no such thing as history. I pause and I say there are only histories, plural. And so what I want to present to you today is my understanding of one of those histories. So Christian nationalism is as old as the first colonies and what we would eventually be called the United States of America. It's a mixture of, and so get ready for a few heavy words, Platonic dualism, Puritanism, extreme American exceptionalism, and white male supremacy, justified both legally and morally by the doctrines of discovery, U.S. law, and the misreading of the Christian scriptures. At the root of Christian nationalism is the inability for white, particularly male, Christians to view anyone else as equal to themselves or even sometimes as human beings. Not Black Christian males, not white Christian females, not white male Muslims or white male Buddhists. Historically, this sense of superiority has been enshrined and promoted as American patriotism and faithfulness to God. It's Jesus wrapped in the American flag. It's patriotic songs sung in worship along with Christian hymns. It's that American flag on next to your pulpit. Starting with the Puritans and the Pilgrims, who seem to have discovered in the Bible themselves, applying it to themselves. And of course, they understood themselves as often the new Israel. And of course, the Indians were the Canaanites. To the Puritans, America was the promised land. Puritan governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony, John Winthrop, declared that the natives had a natural right to the land, but not a legal right. Pilgrim William Bradford, after finding food stores and piles of bones of the early inhabitants who had been wiped out by European disease and what would be called Plymouth, felt God had wiped out the inhabitants to make room for the Pilgrims, who were white, Western Europeans, and men, of course, in charge of everything. Cotton Mather, prominent Puritan theologian, declared the genocide of Pequot men, women, and children was necessary because they had light from the scriptures. These extraordinary assumptions were supported by the fact that all the early charters, granted mostly by King James I, that's our KJV guy of England, assumed the land had already belonged to England. The Puritan ethic left no room for dissension or tolerance of other beliefs or religious practices. Thomas Morton, an early settler, founder of Merrimont, apparently cut from a more risque cloth, harshly criticized during their time the Puritans, and found his book, New English Canaan, as perhaps the first book ever banned within these shores. Bradford called New England Canaan an infamous and scurrilous book against God and the chief men of the country, full of lies and slanders and fraught with profane calamities against their names and persons and the ways of God. Years later, Manifest Destiny was simply a 19th century expression of that doctrine of discovery. But now it was not just the rulers and authorities to act upon this premise, but rather the right of every average white citizen. Quoting premier missiologist David Bosch, who said, "Manifest Destiny is a product of nationalism." The result of this was that at one point or another in recent history, virtually every white nation regarded itself as being chosen for a particular destiny and as having a unique charisma. Following as it did in the wake of the revivals, it was only natural that it acquired very clear religious overtones, and also that it would soon be wedded to the foreign mission enterprise. To the average white American citizen, the command to go west was tantamount to the Great Commission. The census killing of Native Americans, the ecological damage done to the community of creation, the kidnapping of indigenous children and sentencing them to residential boarding schools, literally a chamber of horrors for many, the restriction to reservations, etc., was necessary to the rationale of Christian nationalism because bringing up the savage to a better social standing was their Christian duty. This Christian nationalism DNA was set from the beginning, but in contrast with another DNA that was already present and deep-seated in this land, which we call Turtle Island. Although there were certainly wars among Native Americans, none that I've ever discovered were fought over religion. In fact, one of the early criticisms of Native Americans was their religious tolerance. This tolerance of diversity was learned from the land itself. Those Enlightenment-bound Platonic dualists could not recognize the land as a teacher, but only as inferior to themselves. These two opposing factions are still very present in America. A portion of Americans wish to clamp down on tolerance in favor of exclusion and return to the early Puritan ethic, while others are trying to create equity and inclusion for all people, regardless of their gender, race, or religious convictions. Although both the Democrats and the Republicans have adopted American exceptionalism, I don't think you can actually be elected president nowadays without at least saying that you believe in it. The GOP has employed it skillfully. The modern era saw the same vision of exclusion and return to American values through the Republican agenda of Presidents Reagan, Bush Sr., and Bush Jr., who felt they could gain political power by leveraging the Puritan ethic of American exceptionalism. The GOP found themselves in bed with the likes of James Dobson and his family values, Jerry Falwell's moral majority, and those in-betweeners who could articulate the exclusionary principle so well, like Phyllis Schlafly and Pat Buchanan. Today, con men like Donald Trump, using figures like Franklin Graham, have won a majority of evangelicals and the religious right over to their cause, and much of the GOP has created a cult-like following based on exclusionary, white supremacist, patriarchal, Christian nationalism. And Jesus wept. Lisa?
Wow. Thank you so much, Randy. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Soon-Chan. Thank you, Nikki, for moderating this prestigious group. I'm very honored to be teaching with my friends and with my colleagues. It's awesome that we have had the history laid out for us. We have definitions clarified, and we also have the imagination of white Christian nationalism put clearly to the fore. My job is to help us to understand, what is it that white nationalism wants, and how do they get it? How can we see them getting it? And then what is our call in relationship to that? So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hold on one second while I do that. There we go. Can you all see that, Nikki? Gonna need you to actually speak it because I can't.
You can see that.
Great, wonderful. So what does it want? How does it get it? And what is our call? What does white nationalism want? Now, I am specifically taking the Christian part out of it for now, and then I'm going to drop the Christian part back into it in a little bit. But let's just do the pure white nationalism. But I wanted to say, I recognize what has been said earlier, which is you really can't extricate them. I agree with that. But I think you'll understand what I'm getting at in a little bit. So what they want is exclusive white space. They want 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 exclusive white space. This is the yearning of the white heart. Exclusive white space. And when I say white, I don't mean someone with lighter skin. I mean someone who actually agrees with the lie that there are people created that God calls white, and that God has deemed them to be the exclusive ones on earth who are called and created with the capacity to exercise dominion in the world, as we see on the first page of the Bible. But the reality is that on that first page, we know that actually it's not only people of European descent that were offered that ability, it's anybody who is a human being. But it is the yearning of the white soul, the one who claims that top of the hierarchy of human belonging, to have white space. Exclusive white space. And another thing that they want is exclusive white rule. Exclusive white rule. U.S. Immigration Act of 1790 declares that only free white people can become naturalized citizens in the United States of America. Why is that significant? Because naturalization offers the ability to actually rule, to run for office, to vote, to exercise dominion on the land, to exercise agency, making decisions that impact the course of the future of the land. And so in the very first Immigration Act, in the very first Congress, we limited that to free white persons. And by the way, later on, it actually makes it explicit white men and their property, which included their wives. Lynching is an example of the desire for free white or exclusive white rule. It comes on the tail end of Reconstruction, which saw 2,000 people of African descent rise into public office across the country within less than a decade after the Civil War, after being freed from slavery. And it was the compromise of 1877, where the government said, we'll take our federal troops out of the South in order to make the South play nice with the North in our federal government, and y'all can deal with race in your own way. This was the result. Exclusive white rule in the South, which led to lynching. It also led to the Chinese Exclusion Act. It didn't lead to it, but it was one of the things that came out of that era. The Chinese Exclusion Act, again, excluded people of Asian descent from rule, from the ability to become naturalized citizens. We see this at work in all colonized spaces, especially colonization in Europe. This was an MO, a modus operandi. In Africa, Cecil Rhodes had a vision. His vision was that there would be a train that would ride from Cairo to Cape Town and all the areas that you see red on this map. And what he said was, all that red, that's my dream, that it would be Africa for England, that exclusive white rule would cut its way through the heart of Africa. In Brazil, they believed in eugenics. At the end of slavery in Brazil around 1888, they issued a call to Europe to whiten Brazil. They said, come and help us whiten our nation, because Brazil actually had taken more enslaved people from Africa than any other nation on earth. And so they were a very Black country. And they said, help us to whiten our nation. And so they reserved rule in Brazil for people of European descent. Now that's ironic, since the president that freed the enslaved people in Brazil was actually Black. He had Black heritage, but it didn't go that way once they adopted the bad science of eugenics. In Nazi Germany, they wanted exclusive white rule. They practiced ethnic cleansing in order to get that. They removed people from the land and got that idea, by the way, from America, from the removal of indigenous peoples from the land across the American continent. And then we see in South African apartheid, the removal of people from the land in order to make space for exclusive white rule. This is not just an American thing. This is something that is, like I said, an MO of colonization across the planet. And we are a part of that. And in fact, South Africa got its idea of apartheid from our Jim Crow. They only perfected it. They made it almost immutable. And we can look and see how it has taken shape in our own politics today. When you look at this picture, this is the picture of President Trump's White House. Only 2 people of color in this picture and only 3 women. So this is the manifestation of what Randy and others have been talking about. Now let's add Christian to the mix. What do we get when we add Christian to the mix? The imagination of exclusive white Christian rule. This is the millennial reign. This is that time after Jesus comes again, when he's going to rule on earth in his peaceable kingdom for 1,000 years. What is the imagination of that time? Everybody who is ruling is white. And Jesus is white, and God is white. And so we go right back to Pleasantville. This is the Christian Pleasantville. And what is it? To what imagined end is all of this? It's to the imagined end of white flourishing. This is actually a painting that comes directly out of Nazi Germany. It's to the imagined end of white, exclusive white flourishing. There ain't nothing wrong with people of European descent flourishing. What's wrong is when we imagine flourishing to be exclusive. In White Too Long, Robbie P. Jones, author of White, the author, explains that the perceived external threat of racial and cultural change primed white Christians for receptivity to Donald Trump. In the course of a single political campaign, Jones says, Donald Trump converted white evangelical voters, values voters, into nostalgia voters. So they were voting for this. PRRI asked 2,500 adults living in 50 states, do you long for the 1950s? The majority of all white Americans, and let me just make this clear, all white Americans across the board, white evangelicals, white Republicans, white Democrats, white Catholics, white mainliners. Did I say white Democrats? White Democrats. All of them said, yes, they long for the 1950s. But when they asked the same question of people of color across the board, the answer was no. Why would that be so? Because Emmett Till was the 1950s. Redlining for people of color, while white families got free housing and education from the GI Bill, was the 1950s. 1950s was before the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Immigration Act, and the Clean Air Act. The 1950s, 59% of people of African descent in America were living under the poverty line. The 1950s was before the Stonewall Massacre launched the LGBTQIA movement. 1950s was before decades before the Americans with Disabilities Act began to level the playing field for people with disabilities. So here's the thing. within now 24 years, not even 25 years, we are going to have an America that is the majority people of color within our nation. And Robbie Jones says something very clear in his in a presentation that I saw him give, that means that the majority then of leadership positions in America will likely be taken up by people of color. How do we feel about that? How do we feel about that? I'll tell you, I drew a blank once. I was asking the question of myself, when do I remember, can I remember back to a time when there was a time when people of European descent entered into a land and did not imagine that they should be the ones ruling there? Now, mind you, I'm not talking about Nazis. I'm talking about white folk, just white folk, people of European descent. Where they go in the world, they do not imagine that they should be the ones ruling on that land. When was that time? When was that time? I drew a blank. And then I remembered, there was a time. You have to trace back 3,000 years, more than 3,000 years, to before the Greek Empire, to find the moment, that era, when people of European descent did not enter into other places of the world and imagine that they should be the ones to rule there. So we have a choice, my friends. We have a choice. We can choose mass deportation and criminalization of asylum seekers. We can choose de facto death by government inaction on COVID-19. We can choose insurrection. We can choose voter suppression. We can choose LGBTQIA eradication. We can choose to hasten Armageddon. Or we can choose the reign of God. We can choose brown Jesus. We can choose brown, oppressed, colonized Jesus, who came from a serially enslaved people. And brown Jesus taught us to pray in the context of an explicitly white supremacist empire called Rome. Our Father in heaven, not white supremacist Caesar, who told his subjects to call him Papa, but no, our Papa in heaven, hallowed be your name. Yours is the highest name, not white supremacist Caesar. Your kingdom come, your rule come, not Caesar's rule come. Your will be done, not Caesar's will be done, on earth as it is in heaven, right here, right now. Give us this day our daily bread. You know, back in those times, there was a cart that Caesar would take the centurions, would put the centurions on a cart and it would be full of a mound of bread, and they would go through the streets of their colonized nations, and they would toss bread into the crowd because they had already spread salt on the land in order to make the people that they had dominated dependent on them. And they would say, this is your daily bread. This was called the daily bread. And so Jesus says, no, Papa in heaven, you give us our daily bread, not white supremacist Caesar. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, as we forgive Caesar who has trespassed against us. The enforcers of Jerusalem's colonization. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Not Caesar's, not the kings, not the autocrats, not the despot, not even the Christian king. No, we are citizens of the kingdom of God, not the kingdoms of men, not even the kingdom of Christians, but the kingdom of God. Amen, amen, and amen. And to what end? To this end. To Psalm 85, 10 and 11 end. To the end that says, steadfast kindness and trustworthiness will meet. Equity and shalom will kiss each other. Truth-telling and will spring up from the ground, and justice will look down from the sky. This, my friends, is our call. This is our call. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Lisa, Daniel, Randy, and Soong-Chan. I appreciate all that you have brought and shared, and looking forward to some continued engagement. One of the first questions that we have from the audience was a request. Daniel, you had some excellent definitions that felt like the other speakers did a great job of building upon. Would you mind sharing those just so folks could have a chance to jot those down or capture it? That would be fantastic.
I'm showing my my Zoom lack of knowledge. How do I make sure that I have it on my screen, but how do I make sure it shows up on here?
On the bottom, it says share screen, and you should have the ability now to
Yo,
select.
how long have we been in COVID lockdown and you still don't know how to do share screen?
You know what, Doc? I'm gonna be real respectful on here right now and just take. I don't have. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
I see it now. There it is.
Just saying.
Yeah.
Let's send a question over to Soong-Chan and give him something to do. Otherwise, he's going to cause
that's what he needs.
trouble if he has too much time on his hands here. But thanks so much, Daniel, for posting those. This actually is a question that did come up, Soong-Chan, during your section, and I wonder if you would maybe make a comment, but opening it up to all the panelists. Can you say more about the difference or the relationship between Christian nationalism and American exceptionalism?
Yeah, it's kind of like chicken and egg, as in what comes first. And it's sort of like the difference between imagination and narrative, right? So the imagination says that America is an exceptional nation. The imagination says that we have we've kind of gone through these places and have emerged as a great and exceptional nation. But the narrative is that leads to this understanding of Christian nationalism, that we should expand that. And it's exactly what Lisa described. This is the agenda, and the narratives are driving this agenda. So it's there's subtle differences, but I think it really is the difference between what is the imagination that undergirds the narrative and what is the narrative that informs the imagination. The imagination is the belief of American exceptionalism. The narrative is we need to keep moving towards this Christian nationalism. And then the product of that, of course, is again, a lot of what Lisa described of this is what happens when you have this imagination and narrative.
Fantastic. Thank you. Are there others who want to jump in on that?
That was pretty good.
I'll move us to the next question. We do have your presentations, I think, spurred a lot of really good and thoughtful reflection for folks. Can we apply some of the analysis that you all are talking about to what's going on with Israel and Palestine, where Israel is allowed to defend itself, but any attempt of Palestine to defend itself is called terrorism? Can you all help us, as part of understanding a little bit better, maybe help unpack or how you might use some of those lenses to understand what's going on between Israel and Palestine right now?
I'll jump in on this. First of all, I want to draw your attention, please, to the Freedom Road podcast on anti-Semitism. It's a very important conversation. It was an incredibly important conversation for me, because I think what it helped me to understand is it helped me to see the existential threat that people of Jewish descent feel around the world, not just in Israel, but literally because of a cyclical pattern of genocidal tendencies directed at them across history for millennia, for multiple millennia. And so it's important to understand that. If you don't understand that, you will not understand the politics of our day. That said, there is such a thing as just war theory. And the reality is that even if you're not somebody who thinks that war is always bad, right? So there's like a spectrum of thought about war. And so pacifists would say war is never, ever justifiable. There's this middle of the road theory that says, well, there is something called just war. And just war, one of the primary or critical elements of it is proportionality. So that, and also that it has to be an imminent threat in order for you to engage in military acts that have the capacity to, first of all, spin out of control and then also kill many, many people. You have to have imminent threat against you, your nation state. But then also you need to, your response needs to be proportional to the threat that has come at you. So when we look at the current conflict as it's unfolding on our screens every night, and when we go watch the news, we can see with our own eyes, we know from the numbers. I think today, I saw today that at least as of this morning, 200 Palestinian people have died. 10 Israelis have died. The Palestinian people have lobbed more than 1,000 bombs, all trying to get them into Israel. So there's a real threat, an actual threat. But Israel has an incredible, something we don't even have, an incredible defense system that has deflected most of those bombs. And so only a few have actually gotten through and so killed 10 people. Meanwhile, Israel is using military might, air war and also ground war to lob bombs and at Palestinian apartment buildings and civic centers. And that's why we have the high death toll that we have so far. So the question of whether this is a just war is actually very clear on the international stage. It is not. It is not a just war, even by the middle of the road standards. And that is why on both sides of the aisle in the United States of America, where our government tends to be very, very much a friend of Israel, we have people calling for a ceasefire and people are working diplomatically. So that's the political background. That's the diplomatic background. Now, whether or not we can say that that the logic that Soon-Chan Ra put forward about the imagination is the case here, I have to say, I think that's a complicated question, and I would love to hear others respond to that. But I'm, being a student of human rights, I'm aware that in order to be called a terrorist action, it has to be an act against a nation state. And because Palestine has not been declared a nation state or a state, it is a people, but it hasn't been declared. Well, actually, it has been recognized by the UN as its own state. So maybe that, maybe my thinking needs to be developed there. But that normally you would not be able to call an act like that against a non-state as a terrorist act. Well, you know what? Honestly, the question you have to ask ultimately is, who does that benefit? Who set the rules? It's probably it's worthy of more discussion.
Maybe a quick response around the imagination issue. The theological imagination is at play here because if America views itself as an exceptional people, and biblically, theologically, the only people that are the chosen people is Israel, in some ways, it's justifying American exceptionalism to say, oh, look how special we are. We are on the side of the chosen people. We are protecting the chosen. We are the protectors of God's chosen people in the Bible. And therefore, this affirms our American exceptionalism. So I don't think if that's the whole story, but there's a thread of that where American exceptionalism with the theological imagination says, isn't it great what we do to protect God's people or God's chosen people? And that, I think, is part of the imagination, diseased imagination, but imagination.
That's so interesting. So there's kind of all of these rivers that sort of feed into that we really see kind of cropping up.
I'm sorry, one more.
I want to just say one. Go ahead, Lisa. Yeah.
I'm sorry, very quickly. Just to add, one of the reasons why this is happening in the first place is because of the strong support for Israel, regardless of any subjugation that might happen due to their policies by white Christian nationalists agendas here in the United States, which go right back to the hastening of Armageddon in order to get to that millennia.
And I just wanted to add that, if we look through history, the today's terrorist or yesterday's terrorist becomes tomorrow's heroes. You have, Sitting Bull, Nelson Mandela, Angela Davis. So we have to realize that there are, like I said, many histories to these stories.
Yeah, thank you. That's a helpful reminder. Randy, this next one is going to go right back at you. I'm going to just have you start us off first, and others are welcome to join in. But what do you all think about the project of building national consciousness that was central to many anti-colonial struggles in Latin America and in Africa with Christian and church participation? Are these the same, and how would you understand the differences?
Well, I'm not expert in Latin American, neither theology or anti-colonial efforts, but I can tell you that on this continent, there's been a long history of anti-colonial and decolonizing. And yeah, the more we educate ourselves on those, I mean, we have some great thinkers, some who come out of Latin America, like Paulo Freire. But then we have homegrowns like Miles Horton and lots of other people who write on anti-colonialism and the decolonial experience. I guess you're giving this to me because you want me to plug my book, Decolonizing Evangelicalism. I don't know. But yeah, so there's lots to say, lots of writers right now who are writing on this. And I don't know that we have to even go to Latin America. We have lots of writers right now. Who are writing on this. Yeah.
Do any of the other panelists want to comment on any observations from the Latin American or the African context? Otherwise, that's a great pivot to ways to
Can I
study.
randomly comment? Can I randomly comment on this?
Absolutely. Andy Smith, randomly comment.
Yeah, I think it's also important to say, what do we mean by nationalism? A lot of times we tie nationalism to a nation state that's exclusivist, right? Our nation is not like other nations. But within the Latin American context, there was the growth of indigenous nationhood principles that said nationhood should be inclusive, right? Like I know what my nation is because it's connected and related to all other nations. So I think if we rethink what we think nation is, and that the goal of the liberation struggle or a national liberation struggle doesn't have to be a nation state that's exclusivist. That could be creating a different set of relationships with all nations that's open and inclusive. Then I think that helps us rethink what liberation is.
Fantastic. Daniel, this next question is coming to you first, and then again, an open invitation to everybody else. The January insurrection has brought white Christian nationalism front and center. Should there be more talk about how systemic racism is informing white Christian nationalism?
There should be talk of every form of white supremacy, I think. I think this is one of the things that white Christians are most guilty of, is that we not only perpetuate this present tense, all the different forms of white supremacy and white nationalism, but we fail to take account for, acknowledge, repent of. I think you can make a clear case that white Christianity in America there's never been a period where white Christianity was not creating cover for white supremacy. So when stuff like that happens, it's a direct result of the deep sickness that's inside of our history. So yeah, I think it's a shame that it's not more intuitive that an immediate link can be made when an obvious form of like that happens to the historical reality of the way we've created cover for it since the very beginning here. But more than created cover, oftentimes are most explicitly advancing it.
Thank you. Do others want to comment on that?
Sorry, I'll just add that when I first heard the question, the thing that stood out to me was, I wonder if the influence could actually be switched, because I think that actually it is our Christian imagination that has formed, in many cases, white Christian nationalism, and especially in white nationalism. You can't, and it is really true. I don't remember exactly who it was now who said it, whether it was Soon Chan or Daniel, but it is really true that you can't extract them, that in every form, every time you see white nationalism rise up, there is some Christian ritual that's mixed in with it. With the Ku Klux Klan, there were literally liturgies that they did. There were they literally burned a cross, and for them, most of them, that comes out of their, interestingly, their Scottish heritage of burning. They actually burned a cross in Scottish culture for other reasons. It wasn't the racist thing, but it developed into that, and they happened to be the settlers who went that direction after the Civil War. So I think that what we need to do is we need to do a very, very deep examination on the ways that our own faith has been colonized. We don't really know Jesus. We certainly don't know brown Jesus. We don't know brown colonized Jesus. We don't know brown colonized, serially enslaved Hebrews. And we don't understand that every single book of the entire Bible was written by someone like that, not by someone who rested it in white empire.
Yeah, thank you. That is really helpful. I think one of the things, as we're talking about these concepts that are pretty complicated concepts that are sort of pervasive, and how do you help make a link for many of the folks who just don't get it or are unable to see it? Are there a couple of the fruits of Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism that can help us make that link or help spur on to action? Or any comments?
I'm not sure how to make that link. I'll tell you that, I've kind of faced the frustration. But when Mark and I wrote the book on Doctrine of Discovery, one of the chapters that I thought could spark the most interesting conversation was the chapter on trauma, and that even the perpetrators can experience trauma just in a different way, that there is trauma felt by those who have been oppressed, but that, in fact, if you think about PTSD in wartime, it's the ones that did the killing that sometimes have the most trauma. It's the drone operators that feel the most trauma. So one of the ways that I've kind of thought this through is, when I saw those clips of the national insurrection at the Capitol, talk about traumatized people. I mean, we're talking about some people with some deep, deep trauma. And the way they were praying in the house, the way the violence they claimed was bad a second ago against the police, and now all of a sudden they are doing exactly what they claimed was not good, attacking police officers. Blue Lives Matter. I guess at that moment it really didn't. That's a severely traumatized people group who are operating out of a diseased theological imagination. So I don't know if there's an answer, but I'm hoping there will be, I don't know if it's greater compassion or a sense of some kind of justice and mercy, but it's helped me to say, when a person acts out of that deep trauma, there's going to be a whole lot of dysfunction. So we've got to address that, and not just people of color. I think that's clear, but white folks have also been traumatized by white supremacy and by Christian nationalism.
Thank you. I am so grateful to have shared this conversation with you all. Thank you, Soon Chan, Randy, Lisa, and Daniel. I don't know about the rest of you out there. I feel like we have just begun the conversation, and just to encourage you all and invite you all, this is the beginning of a week of lamenting Christian nationalism. It's a week of embodied action, and we want to encourage you to participate and join in as a community as we try to stir the imagination of what the church and the people of faith can look like lived out in relationships of love. You can feel free to join us tomorrow for a Twitter Power Hour that'll be happening from 11 a.m. to 12 p.m. Pacific. You can also check out other events that are happening, and please feel free to add your own on the website, lamentingchristiannationalism.org. There will also, on Thursday, join us as we continue the conversation with a BIPOC panel of Christians who are trying to stand in solidarity together as we try to move beyond Christian nationalism. That webinar will happen on Thursday at 4 to 5:30 p.m. Register on the lamentingchristiannationalism.org website if you want to get the link for that. But thank you so much, both to the panelists and to the audience. Appreciate you joining and sharing your gifts and your conversation and insights with us. I'm Nikki Toyama-Sito, Executive Director for Christians for Social Action. This webinar was sponsored by Evangelicals for Justice. Thank you for joining us.